Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern or breaks with you?
I was told, point blank, that I wasn't welcome at Christmas this year, and it wasn't said in a way that left any room for misunderstanding or soft interpretation. It was delivered with that cutting, matter-of-fact tone that my family has always reserved for me, the one that makes it clear I should just accept my place in the hierarchy and not make a scene. The reasoning behind it was even worse than the words themselves, because my mother didn't try to dress it up as a misunderstanding or a practical issue about space or schedules. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "This holiday is just for the successful ones," as if she were doing me a favor by finally telling me the truth out loud instead of letting it hover in the background like it always has. And I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't say a word to defend myself, because in that moment I realized something far bigger than the insult. I realized I was finally done letting them decide what my worth was, and that the most powerful response I could give was silence. You need to understand the history to see why that sentence carried such weight, because my family has always measured everything in terms of appearances and status, and from the time we were kids it was clear who the stars were meant to be. My brother, Jason, was the golden child, the one with the business suits before he even had a business, always bragging about his connections, his commissions, his so-called brilliance that nobody outside of our living room seemed particularly impressed with. Yet my parents worshipped him like he was the second coming of Rockefeller. My sister, Hannah, was the polished one, the homeowner, the mother who posted carefully staged family photos with seasonal decor and captions about blessings and gratitude. And then there was me, the one who never quite matched their definition of making it, because while I worked hard, paid my bills, and kept myself afloat without handouts, I didn't flash it, didn't show it, didn't fit the mold of what they wanted to show off at Thanksgiving or Christmas. The irony is that for years I was the one who made sure their proud little empire didn't collapse under the weight of their own bad decisions. They had nearly lost their house a few years back after my father lost a contract he had foolishly bet everything on, and while they cried about the unfairness of banks and the cruelty of the system, I was the one who stepped in quietly, set up an automatic transfer, and began covering the payments that kept a roof over their heads. They never asked where the sudden relief came from, and I never volunteered the truth, because on some level I wanted them to have their pride. Month after month I moved money from my account into theirs, telling myself it was the right thing to do for parents who had raised me, even if they raised me unevenly. And I carried that secret like a weight on my chest while listening to them gush about Jason's promotions and Hannah's house upgrades, never once acknowledging that without me they would have been selling furniture to keep the lights on. When my mother delivered her little announcement about Christmas being just for the successful ones, I watched my father nod along, watched Jason smirk like he'd finally won some imaginary competition between us, and watched Hannah look uncomfortable but say nothing because silence has always been her way of protecting her own comfort. They wanted me to feel small, to feel embarrassed that I wasn't good enough to sit at their perfect holiday table, and for once I didn't rise to the bait. I nodded slowly, as if the words had landed and cut me, but in my head a switch had flipped, and I knew that all the years of quiet sacrifice were about to end in one decision that none of them would see coming. I drove home that night not angry in the way I might have been years ago, not crying the way I had after countless family dinners where I was belittled with backhanded compliments, but strangely calm, as if my parents had finally given me permission to stop carrying the burden I had taken on for them. The thought came to me in one clean, sharp wave: if Christmas is only for the successful ones, then let's see how successful they are without the invisible safety net I've been keeping under them for years. They believed the bank had cut them a special deal. They believed their success and good credit had earned them favor. They believed they were floating on their own merit, when in reality it was me, the one they left off the guest list, who was holding them above water. That night, I logged into my account, stared at the recurring transfer I had set up years ago, and hovered over the cancel button. My fingers shook slightly, not from doubt but from the weight of the moment, because this wasn't just about money, it was about finally refusing to play the role they had written for me. The role of the quiet supporter who never got credit but always paid the cost. I didn't click cancel yet, not immediately, because part of me wanted to savor the knowledge that I held the key to their security, and that they had no idea how close they were to watching it slip away. What struck me most was how easily they had dismissed me, as though erasing me from a holiday table was nothing, while all the while they had been eating because of me, sleeping under a roof because of me, bragging about their so-called stability because of me. They didn't know it yet, but by trying to humiliate me with their successful ones only rule, they had written the ending to a story that was about to play out in ways none of them could control. I sat there in the dark, my laptop screen glowing back at me, thinking not about the hurt they had caused, but about the power I had been holding all along, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of satisfaction instead of resentment. I didn't need to argue with them. I didn't need to send a speech about fairness or love or hypocrisy. I didn't need to make them understand with words. All I needed to do was cancel one transfer, and the silence that followed would speak louder than anything I could ever say. And as that thought settled in my chest, I realized the next chapter of this story wasn't going to be about me proving my worth to them. It was going to be about watching them discover, piece by piece, that the one they thought was least successful was the only reason they had been able to pretend they were winning at all. And that, more than any seat at their Christmas table, was a gift I was finally ready to give myself. When people hear that a daughter quietly covered her parents' mortgage for years, they assume it must have been some grand plan or a showy gesture to buy approval, but the truth in my case was simpler and a little uglier. Because it started with one exhausted phone call from my mother back when my father's last contract fell apart and the mortgage company had started sending letters with words like delinquent and acceleration that made her voice crack. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table and deciding, without any press release and without any drama, that I would set up an automatic transfer from my account straight to their servicer so that the house would not be the next casualty of my father's pride and my mother's ability to look away from hard numbers when the numbers were not flattering. I did not tell my brother because he would have turned it into a committee meeting about responsibility while somehow nominating himself chairman of the praise, and I did not tell my sister, because she would have asked if it would affect the gift budget she plotted out on those cute notepads she likes, so I simply called my credit union, gave them the mortgage information I had pulled out of a wrinkled envelope, and built a payment that went out like clockwork every month, invisible and boring and life-saving in a way that no one wanted to think about once the immediate panic had passed. The part that still stings, even after everything that came next, is how quickly they decided the worst was over and the story had become proof of their resilience. Because within a few months the way they told it to friends at church and to neighbors on the driveway was that they had negotiated something clever with the bank or qualified for a hardship program because of their spotless history. And I would sit there during Sunday lunch and listen to my father explain how disciplined budgeting had pulled them through while the statement in my email showed the transfer I had just funded, and I would decide, again and again, to keep my mouth shut because I thought that maybe their pride was worth more than my need to be seen. I stayed anonymous when the property tax escrow had a shortage and an additional draft hit their account that would have bounced without the cushion I kept in place, and I stayed anonymous when my mother's copay for a specialist visit came at the same time as the water bill, and I moved a little extra because the timing would have crushed her, and I stayed anonymous when my father's truck insurance renewed at a higher rate and he blamed the state for everything while I was the one who held the overdraft at bay. The problem with rescuing people who refuse to admit they needed rescuing is that you train them to rewrite the past, and then you get to watch them perform that rewritten past to your face, and I kept telling myself that my silence made me strong and mature, when in reality it made me a convenient ghost who did a lot of heavy lifting without taking up any space at the table. That ghost role was so familiar to them that when they decided to announce their new tradition of a successful one's only Christmas, it did not occur to them that the person they were cutting out had been underwriting the photo backdrop they love to post every year. And it did not occur to them because my invisibility was a feature, not a bug, and it served them so well that they did not even feel the need to justify it beyond the lazy insult they tossed at me like I should be grateful for the honesty. The thing is, when you finally say the inside part out loud, you stop giving the other person any reason to keep pretending, and that is exactly what snapped in me after my mother's little speech, because I went home and pulled a folder from my drawer that contained the loan number, the escrow breakdown, and the authorization letter I had on file in case I needed to call the servicer, and I looked at it the way you look at a piece of equipment you have used for years without thanks and suddenly realize you are allowed to set it down. I did not blow up anyone's phone or write a message that could be screenshotted and circulated for group outrage. Instead, I started with the small supports that had grown like ivy around the main payment. Because over time I had added things that made my parents' life easier in quiet, almost invisible ways, and I wanted to feel each thread come loose so I would not later tell myself that I had acted rashly. I logged into the pharmacy program where I had been topping up their prepaid balance so my mother never had to decide between a refill and a grocery run, and I closed the account with a polite note that acknowledged she was an adult who could manage her own purchases. And then I went to the auto insurance site where I had set my card as the backup payment when my father had tried a new insurer and forgotten a midterm adjustment, and I removed my card and the backup authorization with the same steady hands I use when I am trimming something dead off a plant so that the rest of it can finally grow on its own. I checked the utilities I had once covered during a heat wave and found that those had stayed current without me for a while, which actually made me feel a little relief, because it reminded me that stepping back was not the same thing as pushing them over. None of that would have mattered if I had left the big one in place, and I knew that, so I opened the credit union portal and pulled up the recurring mortgage transfer that had become part of my monthly pulse. And I sat there long enough to hear my own arguments line up one last time, because I am the kind of person who needs to be sure, even when the choice is obvious. I thought about my mother's voice telling me that Christmas was reserved for success, and how easily she had said it, like labeling me a failure was a mild administrative task. And I thought about my father describing his discipline to people who would never see the draft I funded 2 days earlier, and I thought about my brother's performative generosity that somehow never produced a check when checks were needed. And I thought about my sister's loyalty to comfort over fairness, and I let the anger rise just enough to burn off the last of my guilt without boiling over into pettiness. I clicked into the settings, read the little sentence that said the next draft would occur on the same day it always occurred, and I pictured the calendar page that would arrive at their house with a due date and a balance and no hidden safety net underneath it. And I realized that what I was about to do was not cruelty, it was clarity, because I was not taking anything away from them that they had earned. I was simply refusing to keep faking their victory parade. So I canceled the transfer, and in the same session I removed my authorization to speak on the account so that the next time my mother tried to hand me the phone and ask me to charm a supervisor, the company would politely tell her they could only work with the actual borrower, and I made sure statements would be sent to the address on file and not to me. And when the confirmation emails landed, I forwarded them to a folder I titled Balance, with a calm I had not felt in years. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long minute, not triumphant and not shaky, just clear in a way that made the whole room feel simpler, and I told myself that if Christmas really belonged to the successful ones, then this was me finally accepting their definition and giving them a chance to show me how well it worked without me cheating the test. And as I stood up, I recognized that this was my first clean act of revenge, not loud and not cruel, but exact and deserved and absolutely final, and I knew with a steadiness that surprised me that the next call from my mother would not be about a menu or a gift exchange, but about a payment that had not arrived, and that when she asked me to fix it I would say something I had never said before in my life: no. There is a strange kind of silence that follows a decision you cannot take back, and for me it started the moment I clicked that button to cancel the mortgage transfer, because although nothing physically changed in that exact second, the knowledge that a safety net I had held in place for years no longer existed filled the air with a weight I could almost feel in my chest, and yet instead of panic or regret, what I felt most clearly was an unexpected calm, the kind of calm that comes from finally stepping away from a role you never volunteered for but somehow got trapped in, and realizing that you are allowed to stop carrying people who never once acknowledged the load you took on. In the days immediately after I canceled the payments, I kept waiting for some kind of inner voice to scold me, to whisper that I had gone too far or that I was being ungrateful because my family had raised me, fed me, clothed me. All those lines we repeat to ourselves when guilt starts looking for purchase. But the scolding never came, and instead I noticed how light I felt when I opened my checking account and saw money that wasn't already earmarked for their obligations. And I noticed how much mental space I reclaimed when I no longer tracked due dates that weren't mine to begin with. Of course, my parents did not immediately realize the ground had shifted under them, because banks and servicers move on their own timelines, and when the first month passed without my transfer, all that happened was that a late fee quietly attached itself to their balance, and an automated notice was generated, and my father, who has always considered himself too dignified to read the fine print, tossed the envelope in a stack by the door, muttering about paperwork, never suspecting that this was the first tremor before the earthquake. I did not say a word, not because I lacked the urge, but because I wanted the truth to reveal itself naturally, and I wanted them to see what their supposed success really looked like without me patching over the holes. By the second month, the balance had grown heavier, and the phone calls from the mortgage company started to appear, the ones that begin polite and automated, but eventually escalate to the kind of messages that make people sweat, and that was when my mother's voice started to change whenever she called me, because although she didn't yet admit what was happening, there was a tightness in her tone, a nervous edge, as if she was rehearsing excuses before anyone had even accused her of anything. I will admit there was a small thrill in those early weeks, not a cruel one, but the kind of thrill you feel when you've been underestimated for so long and suddenly the people who dismissed you are forced to face the reality that you were the one holding things together. And I began to sense that thrill every time my phone rang with her name flashing across the screen, because I knew sooner or later the conversation would come, and when it did, I would finally be able to speak without begging, without explaining, without trying to prove that I had value, because the proof was already written in the overdue notices they were now receiving. My brother, naturally, was nowhere to be found when the pressure started building, because he is the kind of man who thrives on applause but disappears when the lights go out, and my sister, true to form, began suggesting they look into refinancing, as if banks are lining up to extend deals to people behind on payments, and my parents, caught between denial and fear, started snapping at each other, and from the outside, I kept my voice steady and polite, but inside I was watching the unraveling I had predicted begin to play out in real time. By the third month, my mother finally broke the wall of pretended composure and called me in a state of nervous energy. I had not heard from her since the first time they nearly lost the house, except now her words carried an edge of suspicion as well as fear. Because she said, "Something is wrong with the bank. They keep saying payments aren't showing up. Can you look into it?" And the way she asked told me she was beginning to realize this wasn't just a clerical error. This was a missing lifeline. I almost laughed when she said it, not because it was funny, but because it was such a perfect example of the way she had always outsourced problems onto me. As though my role in life was to sit on hold with customer service and smooth things over while they told their friends about their discipline and good fortune. But instead of laughing, I simply told her that if something was wrong with the bank, she and Dad should call and straighten it out, because it was their mortgage, their account, their name on the papers, and the pause that followed my words was long enough for me to know she understood I wasn't going to swoop in this time. The guilt she tried to press on me in that silence was thick, and I could hear her struggling to keep the conversation from slipping into accusation, because she didn't want to outright say what she was thinking, which was that maybe I had been involved all along. Maybe I had been doing something behind the scenes, and maybe that something had stopped, but I let her wrestle with it, because after all those years of hearing that I wasn't enough, I wasn't good enough, I wasn't successful enough, I was not about to volunteer comfort when the discomfort was the only thing that might finally teach her the truth. I hung up that night knowing the unraveling had crossed a point of no return, and I felt no regret, only a steady determination, because if they wanted Christmas to be for the successful ones, then they were about to see what their version of success looked like when the invisible scaffolding I had built was gone. And even as I set my phone down, I could picture what was coming next, because once the polite notices and late fees weren't enough to scare them into action, the letters would turn red, the calls would grow harsher, and the fear would no longer be something they could hide in their voices. It would consume their lives until they admitted the truth. And I, for once, was going to let them live with it. When the first real cracks began to show, It wasn't in some dramatic explosion of chaos, but in the quiet unraveling of my parents' routines, because at first they clung stubbornly to the belief that this was all a mistake by the bank. Something a quick phone call could clear up, and so I watched from a distance as they stormed into their local branch, waving papers they barely understood, insisting that their years of loyalty should count for something, and then walking out with the same balance they had gone in with, except now carrying a simmering rage at the system that, in their eyes, had betrayed them. My father called me that evening, his voice bristling with anger, declaring that bankers were thieves who made money out of confusing people, and my mother echoed him in the background, saying they had always been the kind of family who paid their dues and deserved respect. And as I listened to them, I felt that familiar urge to step in and fix it, to log into the account, straighten things out, and relieve their stress, but I reminded myself that the stress they were feeling was the exact weight I had been carrying in silence for years, and that if I rushed in again, they would never learn that the image of themselves they clung to had been sustained entirely by me. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to their voices whenever they spoke to me, because the calls that had once been filled with casual updates or little digs at my supposed lack of ambition now carried undertones of unease, as though they were speaking through clenched teeth, trying to keep up appearances even as the ground beneath them shifted, and I knew it was only a matter of time before their pride cracked wide enough for the truth to escape. By the time the third notice of delinquency arrived, printed in bold letters that could no longer be mistaken for a clerical error, my mother's tone had turned from irritation to something closer to desperation. And she began testing the waters with subtle questions, asking me if I had ever heard of people getting errors on their accounts, or if I thought banks could lose records of payments, and I would answer calmly that mistakes happen. But it was their mortgage, and they would need to resolve it, and each time I deflected, I felt their patience fray a little more. What fascinated me most was the reaction of my siblings, because when the panic finally became undeniable, my parents turned naturally to Jason and Hannah, the self-proclaimed successful ones, and for the first time in years the spotlight shifted off me. Not because I was being ignored, but because they needed saviors who could step in and prove their worth. Jason, of course, gave a speech about how he was managing his own projects and couldn't tie up liquidity in someone else's house, suggesting they look into personal loans while assuring them that he would advise them through the process, which was his way of saying he wanted credit without cost. Hannah, on the other hand, suggested they consider selling family heirlooms or even downsizing, but when pressed to contribute anything concrete, she quietly disappeared behind excuses about her kids' expenses and the stress of modern living. For the first time, my parents had to confront the truth that the children they had exalted were unwilling to bleed for them in the way the one they dismissed had bled quietly for years, and it was in that moment of betrayal by their golden ones that my phone finally rang with the call I had been expecting. My mother's voice trembled as she admitted that they were behind, that the house might be at risk, and she asked me, with a kind of hesitant dread, if I could look into it the way I used to when problems cropped up, and that was the opening I had been waiting for. I told her calmly, with no theatrics, that there was nothing to look into, because the reason payments had stopped was not a bank error, not a misplaced check, but simply that I had chosen to stop making them. The silence that followed was so complete I could almost hear her heartbeat over the line, and then came the flood of disbelief, the gasps of, "What do you mean?" and "Why didn't you say anything?" and my father in the background shouting that this wasn't funny. I didn't shout back, I didn't cry, I didn't let my voice waver. I simply told them the truth they had never wanted to face, that the roof over their heads had been standing because of me, the one they had labeled unsuccessful, the one they had excluded, the one they had thought they could humiliate without consequence. The denial came first, because my father barked that I was exaggerating, that no daughter of his could possibly afford to float a mortgage, as though admitting I was capable was worse than admitting they had been saved. But when I explained dates and amounts, when I referenced the very letters they had been receiving, their denial cracked into silence again, the kind of silence that comes when people are forced to confront a reality they have no spin for. Then came the anger, sharp and raw, because my mother snapped that I should have told them, that it wasn't fair to keep them in the dark, that I had humiliated them by letting them brag about their discipline when it was really my money doing the work. And I couldn't help but laugh quietly at that, because the hypocrisy was too perfect. She was furious not because I had deceived them, but because my silence had preserved their pride until it no longer served them, and now she wanted to rewrite history so that even my sacrifice was another crime against them. And when the shouting settled into a heavy quiet, I delivered the line that had been sitting on my tongue since Christmas. Why didn't you invite me to Christmas if I was the one keeping the lights on? That question landed heavier than any accusation I could have thrown, because it forced them to face the contradiction between the image they clung to and the reality they had ignored, and for the first time in years, they had no answer. My father muttered something about family decisions, my mother stammered about tradition, but both of them knew the truth had cut deeper than their excuses could reach. I ended the call not with a dramatic farewell, but with a calm promise that the days of me shielding them from the consequences of their arrogance were over, and that if they wanted to see how successful they really were, they could do it without me funding the illusion. As I hung up, I felt a clarity that was sharper than relief, because I understood that the unmasking was not just about them finally knowing the truth, but about me finally refusing to hide it. They had built their lives on a lie that I had quietly maintained, and now that lie had collapsed, and in the ruins, they were left to face the truth of who they had really been celebrating all along, and it wasn't Jason or Hannah, it was me, the daughter they had chosen to exile from their Christmas table. And as much as their panic would grow in the days ahead, I knew that the real power had already shifted, because once you show people that their crown was held up by your hands, they can never wear it the same way again. After the call where the truth finally sat between us like a bill nobody wanted to claim, the shift was immediate and almost physical, because the next morning my mother left a message that tried to braid apology with urgency, saying she was sorry for how things sounded at Christmas and that she never meant to hurt me, but also that the bank had placed them in a category that sounded ominous and time-sensitive, and would I please, just this once, help them fix the records, which was her old way of pretending the problem was grammar when the sentence had always been debt, and I listened to it twice, then set my phone down and realized that if I kept talking in the language of feelings while they talked in the language of leverage, I would end up right back where I had lived for years, invisible and useful. So I sat at my table and wrote a single page that said everything plainly, not as a daughter pleading for love, but as an adult setting terms for reality. I wrote that I would never again fund anything in secret, that if they wanted help they would acknowledge in writing what I had already carried, that they would add me to the title so that any future contribution came with responsibility and control instead of shame and stealth, and that before any money moved, there would be a simple letter signed by both of them stating that the story they had told about discipline and deals had been fiction, and that I had been the one keeping the roof overhead, not because I needed applause, but because without honesty any new arrangement would rot from the inside like the old one did. I ended with a deadline that was not dramatic, but was aligned with the bank's own clock. And I told them to forward it to Jason and Hannah so that the successful ones could weigh in with actual help if they preferred that route. The reaction arrived fast and loud, because my father called within an hour to say that no child of his would put conditions on her parents' home, and that I was acting like a loan shark, which was rich coming from a man who had accepted anonymous money for years while lecturing me about humility, and while he was busy performing outrage, Jason chimed in with a group message about how families should not do contracts and how he would mediate if we could all be reasonable, a word that in his mouth always means you pay and I get credit, and Hannah added a soft paragraph about how adding me to the title could complicate taxes, and that she had read an article about it, which was her way of sounding helpful while saying nothing of substance. I responded with one sentence that said I was open to any alternative in which they brought the loan current themselves, after which my phone stopped buzzing and the silence from the successful ones was finally useful. By midweek, the tone shifted from bluster to bargaining, because the bank had escalated the language and the letters were now impossible to treat as clerical errors, and my mother called to say that maybe the paperwork could be signed later if I could just catch up the account now, and I said that later was how we got here, and that if they wanted my help as a grown woman with her own life, they would treat me like a partner, not a ghost, and there was a long pause where I could hear her trying to find a path that preserved pride and property at the same time, and then she asked if she and my father could come by with the documents if I promised to be kind, which broke my heart a little because even now she thought the danger was my tone rather than the math. But I told her to come, and that I would be fair, and that fairness no longer meant disappearing. They arrived with faces that had learned the lesson I could not teach with words, and they brought a notary from the library who did not care about our history, only that the signatures matched the IDs. And we sat at my table while they signed a simple deed that added my name to the title, and they signed a letter that said, in ordinary language, that the payments had been mine and that the stories they told had not been true. And when it was done, my father looked like a man who had swallowed a stone, and my mother looked like someone who had finally let go of a bag that was too heavy to carry, and I felt the anger I had been holding lower into something steadier, not forgiveness and not revenge for the sake of revenge, but the kind of justice that says if you want an adult's money, you will treat her like an adult, and if you want to call Christmas a reward for success, you will live with the definition when it shows up with a pen. I made one transfer that afternoon, not a secret river but a documented bridge that brought the loan current to the exact dollar so that the notices would stop and the countdown would reset. And I stood in the kitchen while it processed and felt no shame and no gloating, only a clarity that the old arrangement had died and that this was a new economy with light and labels on everything. And then I did the thing that put the last piece in place, which was to call a realtor I trusted and ask for an honest evaluation of what a sale would look like within a realistic timeline, because the point was not to trap my parents under my thumb, but to get all of us out of a house that had become a shrine to a lie. And when the numbers came back and the path made sense, I presented it to them the same way I had presented the terms, calm and practical and without apology. Predictably, Jason called to accuse me of stealing the family home, and Hannah cried about memories, and my father tried one last time to invoke duty, but I told them that duty without respect is just a leash, and that a smaller place within their actual budget was not a punishment but a cure, and I offered a clean plan. We would list now, we would price like adults. We would use the proceeds to clear the arrears and set up 6 months of rent on a place they could handle without anyone's help. And whatever remained after closing would be split the way the facts demanded, not the way the myths preferred, and if the successful ones wanted to write a check to keep the house, they could do so by the end of the week. Jason changed the subject. Hannah said she needed to talk to her husband, and my parents looked at each other like two people finally hearing the same clock. They agreed, because the alternative was pretending again, and the offer on the house came faster than any of us expected, which felt like the universe confirming what we already knew. That this building had stopped being a home the day they drew a circle called success and placed me outside it, and a month later we sat at a closing where the notary cared once again only about signatures. And the check that cleared the loan also cleared a weight I had been carrying since the first time I moved. Money I could have used for my own future, and I watched my mother exhale like a person whose chest had been tight for years, and my father shook the realtor's hand with a grip that said he was done fighting the wrong enemy. I did one last thing before they left for their new place, something quiet and surgical that felt like the truest expression of what this whole saga had been about, which was to set up an automatic transfer from my account to my own savings labeled Christmas. The amount equal to what I had once paid for their mortgage, except now it was marked for my life, my choices, my eventual down payment, or my plan to build something that does not require lying to exist. And when my mother hugged me at the door and whispered that she wished we could start over, I told her we just did, and that starting over means no more ghosts. So when people ask me if I went too far, if making them sign papers and selling the house was harsh, I tell them that I finally matched my generosity to truth, that I traded a lie that made everyone look good for a structure that lets everyone grow up, and that on the night they used to seat the successful ones first, I made dinner for myself, turned off my phone, and felt the kind of peace that does not need an audience, because I did not ruin Christmas, I simply stopped financing the illusion and paid in full for the truth.